He's confused. The words echoed across the conference room, followed by a few quiet laughs. Captain Ethan Brooks didn't even bother lowering his voice. To him, the old man standing near the back wall was just another aging veteran who had wandered too far into a military briefing he no longer understood. The room smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and polished wood. A large digital screen displayed the face of a young soldier frozen in time. Private First Class Ryan Mercer. Missing in action. 52 years. No remains recovered. No final answers. No closure. The Recovery Task Force had spent decades searching. Historians had reviewed records. Analysts had examined satellite imagery. Teams had walked miles of rugged terrain. Yet the mystery remained unsolved. Walter Hayes stood motionless beneath the glow of the screen. At 87 years old, his frame had narrowed with age, but there was something unusual about the way he carried himself. Calm, balanced, observant, like a man who still noticed details others rushed past. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Not on the room, not on the officers, not on the projector, only the photograph. Captain Brooks followed his gaze and shook his head. Sir, with all due respect, we've had experts working this case longer than I've been alive. A few people nodded. Walter didn't answer. Outside the building, a cold autumn wind rattled the flagpole. The faint sound carried through the glass. Inside, the room remained focused on the briefing. Slides changed. Maps appeared. Search zones highlighted in yellow and red. Decades of work summarized in charts and coordinates. Walter continued staring at the image. Then he quietly said, "You're looking in the wrong place." The room fell silent. Brooks turned. "Excuse me." Walter slowly raised one weathered hand toward the screen. "You're searching where everyone expected him to go." Brooks folded his arms. "That's because every report indicates the same route." Walter's eyes never left the photograph. "The reports are wrong." A murmur spread through the room. Someone sighed. Another officer glanced down at his notes. Brooks forced a smile. "And how exactly would you know that?" Walter took a slow step closer to the screen. His shoes barely made a sound against the floor. "Because that picture tells a different story." Brooks laughed softly. "That photograph was taken from hundreds of yards away over half a century ago." Walter nodded. "I know. Then what could you possibly see that everyone else missed?" For the first time, Walter looked directly at him. His expression was steady, unshaken. "Ryan Mercer." The room grew quiet again. "What about him?" Brooks asked. Walter returned his gaze to the image. He wasn't heading east. Brooks frowned. "How can you tell?" Walter pointed toward a nearly invisible detail near the soldier's shoulder. A detail so small most people couldn't even see it. Because Ryan never tied that cord unless he planned to move north. The laughter disappeared. Several people leaned forward. And for the first time that morning, nobody in the room was looking at the photograph. They were all looking at Walter Hayes. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the screen, then back at Walter Hayes. The confidence that had filled his voice moments earlier was beginning to crack. Around the conference table, officers, analysts, and recovery specialists exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. The old veteran had pointed out a detail so small that most of them could barely see it. Brooks stepped closer to the image and narrowed his eyes. The faded photograph was grainy, damaged by time, and enlarged far beyond its original quality. Yet there it was, a thin strip hanging from Ryan Mercer's rifle sling. Almost invisible, almost meaningless, almost. "You are telling me," Brooks said carefully, "that a piece of cord determines the direction of travel?" Walter nodded once. "Not the cord, the man carrying it." The room remained silent. Walter slowly approached the screen. The glow of the projector illuminated the lines on his weathered face. "Ryan hated loose gear," he said. "Everything had a reason. Everything had a place." Brooks folded his arms again, but this time it felt more defensive than confident. "And you remember that after 52 years?" Walter looked at him. "I remember the people." The answer landed heavily in the room. Sergeant Noah Carter sat near the back of the table, studying both men. He had spent years reviewing military records. He knew memory could fade. Dates disappeared. Locations blurred. Small details were often lost. Yet there was something unsettling about Walter's certainty. It was not the certainty of pride. It was the certainty of recognition. As if he were looking at an old friend rather than a photograph. Brooks turned toward the analysts. Can anyone verify this? A woman seated near the front opened a personnel archive on her laptop. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows lifted. Actually, she said quietly, there is a note here from training records. The room turned toward her. Private Mercer modified his field equipment repeatedly despite being told not to. Brooks frowned. Modified how? She kept reading. Added identification markers. Personal adjustments. Custom tie-down points. Nobody spoke. Walter simply watched the photograph. The analyst continued. One instructor wrote that Mercer tied cord to his sling in a unique way because he said it helped him identify equipment instantly in low visibility. Brooks looked back toward Walter. You knew that? Walter shook his head. I lived it. A faint chill seemed to move through the room. Outside, the wind rattled the windows again. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The ordinary sounds of the building suddenly felt distant. Noah Carter leaned forward. Sir, he said carefully, addressing Walter for the first time. If you are right about the cord, what else do you see? Walter remained silent for several seconds. His eyes traveled across the enlarged photograph, across the uniform, across the equipment, across details everyone else had dismissed for decades. Then his expression changed, very slightly, but enough for Noah to notice. There is something else, Walter said quietly. Something all of you missed. Every person in the room leaned forward. Walter slowly raised his hand toward a shadow near Ryan Mercer's backpack. And if I am seeing it correctly, he said, this photograph was never supposed to be in the file at all. The conference room seemed smaller now. The easy confidence that had filled it earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the screen. What do you mean it was never supposed to be in the file? Walter Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the enlarged photograph. The image had been examined by experts for decades. Historians, analysts, intelligence officers, recovery teams. Yet Walter was looking at it differently. Not as evidence, not as a record. He was looking at it as a memory. Who took this picture? He asked. Several people exchanged glances. An analyst pulled up the metadata attached to the archive. Unknown, she replied. The original source was never identified. Walter nodded slowly. That is the problem. Brooks frowned. Why? Walter lifted a weathered finger toward the dark shape near Ryan Mercer's backpack. Because I know where Ryan was standing that day. The room fell silent again. Noah Carter leaned forward. You were there? Walter looked at him. Less than 30 feet away. Nobody moved. The analyst quickly checked another document. Her expression changed. Sir, she said to Brooks, there is a witness report placing Sergeant Walter Hayes in the same area on that date. Brooks looked back toward the old veteran. The realization unsettled him. Walter turned back to the photograph. The ridge behind Ryan should not be visible from where our unit was located. He paused, which means the photographer was somewhere else. Noah felt a chill crawl up his spine. Somewhere else where? Walter studied the image carefully. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, decades seemed to disappear from his face. Northwest. The word hung in the air. Brooks crossed his arms. You can determine direction from a photograph taken 52 years ago. Walter pointed toward a faint shadow stretching across a rock formation. The sun. Then he pointed toward another, nearly invisible detail. And the tree line. Nobody laughed this time. The analyst enlarged the image further. Grain and distortion filled the screen, but the shadow remained visible. Several specialists began whispering among themselves. One opened a topographical map. Another checked archived weather records. Slowly, expressions began changing around the room. Noah watched it happen one face at a time. Skepticism became curiosity. Curiosity became concern. Concern became something else. Respect. Walter had not guessed. He had observed. Brooks noticed it too. His jaw tightened. Even if you are right, he said, that still does not explain why this matters. Walter finally looked away from the screen. His pale blue eyes settled on the captain. Because if the photographer was standing where I think he was standing, then Ryan Mercer was not traveling toward the river. The room became completely still. Walter turned back toward the image. He was heading toward the ridge. Noah felt his heartbeat quicken. That location had never been included in the official search area. Not once in 52 years. Then the analyst suddenly froze while scrolling through an archive entry. Captain, she whispered. You need to see this. Brooks stepped closer. On her screen was a declassified memorandum stamped decades earlier. The search coordinates matched the river, but a handwritten note at the bottom had been crossed out before the report was filed. Walter saw it instantly. So did Noah. The note contained only 6 words. Search team redirected away from Ridge. The words on the screen seemed impossibly small, yet they carried the weight of half a century. Search team redirected away from Ridge. Nobody in the room spoke. The hum of the projector suddenly sounded loud against the silence. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the declassified memorandum as if hoping the words would change if he looked long enough. They did not. Noah Carter leaned closer to the monitor. The handwritten note had been crossed out with a thick line decades ago, but it remained visible beneath the digital scan. Someone had considered the ridge. Someone had written it down. And then someone had removed it from the official record. Walter Hayes stood motionless. His expression did not change. If anything, he looked sad rather than surprised. I remember the argument, he said quietly. Several heads turned toward him at once. Brooks blinked. You remember this specific report? Walter shook his head. No, I remember the day. His voice carried a calm certainty that made everyone listen. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the autumn sky. The sunlight coming through the conference room windows faded slightly. Walter looked past the screen, beyond the walls, beyond the years. The weather was changing, he said. The ridge was covered in fog by afternoon. Visibility dropped fast. Noah watched him carefully. The old veteran was no longer examining a photograph. He was walking through a memory. The recovery teams wanted to follow the river, Walter continued. It seemed logical. Easier terrain. Better access. Brooks glanced at the map displayed beside the archive file. The river route had indeed become the focus of every search operation that followed. But Ryan never liked easy routes, Walter said. He always chose the higher ground. The room remained silent. Walter stepped closer to the screen. Ryan believed elevation gave you options. He said rivers trapped you. Ridges gave you choices. Noah felt another chill. That was not the kind of detail found in official records. It was the kind of detail only a friend would know. The analyst opened another archive folder. Page after page appeared on the screen. Reports, maps, summaries, search logs. Then she stopped. Captain, she said softly. There is something strange. Brooks moved beside her. What is it? She pointed at a series of coordinates entered over several years. Every search operation followed nearly identical patterns. River valleys, lowlands, accessible routes. The ridge appeared nowhere. Not once. 52 years of investigation. Hundreds of personnel. Thousands of man-hours. Yet the ridge had effectively vanished from consideration. Brooks slowly exhaled. How does that even happen? Nobody answered. Walter looked back toward Ryan Mercer's photograph. His pale blue eyes settled on the young face frozen in time. Then he noticed something. Something he had not mentioned before. His gaze sharpened. Noah immediately saw the change. Sir. Walter stepped closer to the image. The room watched in complete silence. He raised one hand toward a faint mark near the lower corner of the photograph. A mark so small it looked like damage. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his voice dropped almost to a whisper. That is not a scratch. Every person in the room leaned forward. Walter never took his eyes off the image. That is Ryan's handwriting. For several long seconds nobody moved. The enlarged photograph filled the screen, casting a pale glow across the conference room. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the tiny mark near the lower corner of the image. To everyone else it looked like a flaw in the aging print. A scratch. A crease. Damage from decades of storage. Yet Walter Hayes was looking at it, as if he had just found a voice buried beneath 52 years of silence. That is impossible, Brooks finally said. Walter did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Noah Carter stepped closer to the screen. Can you enlarge it? He asked. The analyst immediately adjusted the image. Pixels spread across the display. The mark grew larger. Grainy. Distorted. Difficult to interpret. Yet Walter seemed certain. Ryan used to write on everything, he said quietly. Maps. Equipment tags. Field notebooks. Even photographs. Brooks shook his head. You cannot identify handwriting from a mark that size. Walter slowly nodded. Normally, no. Then he pointed toward the faint shape. But Ryan never wrote the letter or the way most people do. The room fell silent again. Noah leaned closer. There it was, barely visible. The first stroke curved slightly outward before dropping down. An unusual habit. Small, distinctive, personal. The analyst opened another archive file containing scanned documents from Ryan Mercer's service record. A training evaluation appeared beside the photograph. Everyone stared at the signatures. Then they stared back at the image. The shape matched. Not perfectly, not conclusively, but enough to make the room uncomfortable. Brooks folded his arms tighter. Even if it is his handwriting, what does it say? Walter narrowed his eyes. The photograph reflected in them like a distant memory returning from somewhere far away. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The sound carried through the room. Steady, rhythmic, familiar. Walter barely seemed to notice. Suddenly his expression changed. Noah saw it immediately. A flicker of recognition. Not certainty yet, but something close. Walter took a slow breath. The room waited. "It is not a message," he said. "It is a marker." Brooks frowned. A marker for what? Walter looked at the enlarged image again. Then the years seemed to fall away. The conference room disappeared. The rain against the windows became another rain from another time. Warm air. Heavy clouds. Wet jungle leaves moving in the wind. Ryan Mercer kneeling beside him beneath a gray sky. Smiling despite exhaustion. Holding a pencil against the corner of a folded map. "If we get separated," Ryan had said, tapping a small handwritten symbol he always used, "follow this." Walter blinked. The memory vanished. He was back in the room. Every eye was fixed on him. Noah could almost feel the tension building. Walter slowly raised his hand toward the photograph. "That symbol means direction." Brooks stared. Direction to where? Walter's gaze never left the screen. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. The place Ryan planned to reach before anyone lost track of him. Then he pointed directly at the image. "And I think I know exactly where that place is." The room remained frozen after Walter Hayes spoke. Nobody challenged him this time. Nobody laughed. The confidence that had once filled the briefing had slowly drained away, replaced by something far more powerful. Doubt. Not doubt in Walter. Doubt in everything the official investigation had concluded over the past 52 years. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while analysts hurried through digital archives. Screens flickered. Maps appeared. Coordinates overlapped one another across decades of search operations. Sergeant Noah Carter moved between stations, gathering files and comparing notes. The deeper they looked, the stranger the case became. Walter stood quietly beside the photograph. He did not rush anyone. He did not demand attention. He simply watched. Captain Ethan Brooks noticed that. Earlier that morning, he had seen an elderly veteran with fading memories. Now he was looking at a man who seemed to remember details more clearly than the records themselves. "Show me the ridge," Walter said. An analyst immediately projected a topographical map onto the main screen. Rolling terrain appeared across the display. Valleys, streams, dense vegetation. Then the ridge emerged. It sat nearly 6 miles from the primary search area. 6 miles. Not far by modern standards. Yet somehow it had remained outside every major recovery operation for more than half a century. Noah stared at the map. "How did this happen?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Walter stepped closer. His pale blue eyes followed the contours of the terrain. Then he pointed toward a narrow section near the northern slope. There. Several analysts zoomed in. The area appeared unremarkable. A patch of elevated ground surrounded by thick vegetation. Brooks frowned. "Why there?" Walter remained silent for a moment. The rain against the glass seemed louder now. Then he spoke. "Because Ryan always looked for landmarks." His finger moved slightly across the screen. He used ridges to navigate. Another analyst quickly opened old aerial reconnaissance photographs. Grainy black and white images appeared beside the map. Walter examined them carefully. Suddenly he stopped. Noah saw it happen. A tiny change in expression. Recognition. The same look he had shown when he noticed the cord. The same look he had shown when he identified the handwriting. "What is it?" Noah asked. Walter pointed toward a dark shape visible near the ridge. Most people would have overlooked it instantly. "That structure," he said. The analysts enlarged the image. Slowly the shape became clearer. Not a building. Not a vehicle. Something much older. "A fire tower," one analyst whispered. Walter nodded. It was abandoned even back then. Brooks looked confused. What does a fire tower have to do with any of this? Walter never took his eyes off the image. For a moment, he seemed to be listening to a voice nobody else could hear. Then he quietly said, "Because the last promise Ryan Mercer ever made to me involved that tower." The room fell silent. Noah felt a chill run through him. Walter had not spoken about promises before. He had spoken about maps, directions, habits, details. This was different. Personal. Deeply personal. Walter continued staring at the image as memories surfaced behind his eyes. "The night before we were separated," he said softly, "Ryan told me exactly where he would go if everything went wrong." The room remained silent after Walter Hayes spoke. Even the rain seemed softer now, as if the world outside the conference room had faded away. Every eye was on the old veteran. Captain Ethan Brooks slowly lowered his arms. He no longer looked skeptical. He looked unsettled. Walter stood beside the illuminated map, his gaze fixed on the abandoned fire tower displayed on the screen. For a moment, nobody asked a question. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever memory had carried him back across 5 decades. Then Sergeant Noah Carter finally spoke. "What promise?" Walter took a slow breath. The answer did not come immediately. When it did, it sounded less like a statement and more like a voice returning from a distant place. "Ryan said if we ever got separated, he would head for the tower." Noah glanced toward the map. "Why there?" Walter's eyes never left the screen. "Because nobody else cared about it." Several analysts exchanged confused looks. Walter continued. "Most people used roads, rivers, known routes. Ryan was different. He looked for places people ignored." The words settled heavily across the room. Brooks stepped closer to the display. "And you never told investigators this?" Walter finally looked at him. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet disappointment. "Nobody asked me." The answer struck the room harder than anyone expected. Noah felt a knot tighten in his chest. 52 years. Countless reports. Endless reviews. Yet nobody had asked the last surviving witness what he remembered. The realization was uncomfortable. The analyst at the main workstation suddenly looked up. "I found something." Every head turned. She opened another archive folder. An old interview transcript appeared on the screen. The document had been scanned decades earlier and filed away among thousands of unrelated records. "This was recorded 3 months after Ryan Mercer disappeared," she said. Brooks leaned forward. "What does it say?" She scrolled slowly through the faded text. Then she stopped. The room became completely still. Walter's eyes narrowed. He already knew what she had found. "Read it," Noah said. The analyst swallowed. Subject stated that Private Mercer frequently referenced an abandoned observation tower as a potential rally point during navigation exercises. Nobody spoke. Brooks stared at the screen. Walter closed his eyes briefly. There it was. Proof. Not memory. Not opinion. Proof. Hidden inside an archive nobody had reviewed in decades. The analyst continued searching. Seconds later, another document appeared. Then another. And another. Every file pointed toward the same overlooked location. The ridge. The tower. The route Ryan Mercer had always preferred. Noah felt the atmosphere changing. The case was no longer a mystery buried beneath time. It was becoming a trail. A trail somebody had accidentally abandoned years ago. Then another analyst gasped quietly. "Captain," she said. Brooks turned. "What now?" Her eyes remained locked on the screen. "Aerial reconnaissance from the following year." She enlarged the image. The room leaned forward as one. Near the ridge, barely visible through weather damage and age, sat a shape no search report had ever mentioned. Walter's expression changed immediately. "No," he whispered. "It cannot be." Noah looked at him. "What is it?" Walter stared at the image without blinking. "That is Ryan's shelter." The conference room fell completely silent. Nobody questioned Walter Hayes this time. Nobody suggested he was mistaken. The image on the screen remained enlarged, frozen beneath decades of dust, damaged film, and forgotten archives. Yet the longer everyone looked at it, the harder it became to ignore what Walter was seeing. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped closer to the display. "You are certain?" he asked quietly. Walter never looked away from the photograph. Ryan built shelters the same way every time. Noah Carter studied the image. The shape near the ridge was faint, little more than a shadow hidden among weather damage and terrain distortion. Yet Walter's certainty made it impossible to dismiss. The analysts immediately began pulling additional reconnaissance photographs from neighboring years. One image appeared, then another, then a third, each taken from slightly different angles, each degraded by time. Slowly a pattern emerged. The dark shape appeared again and again in nearly the same location. The room grew tense. Brooks rubbed his jaw. How did nobody notice this? Nobody answered. The question lingered in the air. 52 years of investigations. Thousands of pages. Hundreds of personnel. Yet a detail visible across multiple photographs had remained buried inside forgotten archives. Noah watched Walter carefully. The old veteran seemed less interested in proving himself right than understanding what had happened. That unsettled Noah more than anything. Most people would have celebrated. Walter looked heartbroken. Another analyst suddenly raised her hand. Captain. Brooks turned. What did you find? She opened a newly scanned file recovered from long-term storage. This aerial survey was conducted 11 months after the disappearance. The image appeared beside the others. The room leaned forward. Near the ridge, adjacent to the suspected shelter location, a narrow trail became visible. Faint, difficult to see, but present. Walter inhaled sharply. Noah noticed immediately. You recognize it? Walter nodded. Yes. His voice sounded distant. Ryan made trails like that. Brooks looked stunned. You can identify a trail from a photograph taken over 50 years ago. Walter shook his head slowly. Not the trail. He pointed toward a subtle bend near the end of it. The destination. Everyone stared at the screen. Walter's finger remained steady. Ryan always built two things. Noah felt the tension rising again. What two things? Walter answered without hesitation. A shelter and an observation point. The room went quiet. Several analysts exchanged nervous glances. One quickly overlaid elevation data across the map. Seconds later, the software highlighted a small rise overlooking the valley below. A perfect observation position. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Memories seemed to move behind them. Wind, rain, conversations from another lifetime. Then he opened them again. He reached the ridge. Brooks stared at him. You believe he survived long enough to build all this? Walter looked back at the photographs. I do not believe it. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. I know it. Then an analyst at the far end of the room suddenly froze while reviewing a newly digitized inventory log. Her eyes widened. Captain, she said, there is one more file. Brooks turned immediately. What file? She swallowed hard before answering. A recovery report that was never completed. The room stood still as the analyst opened the unfinished recovery report. Rain slid down the conference room windows while the glow from dozens of screens reflected across silent faces. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped closer. Noah Carter moved beside him. Walter Hayes remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the monitor. The file loaded slowly. Decades-old scans appeared one page at a time. Most contained routine notes, weather conditions, survey routes, equipment inventories. Then the final page appeared, the page everyone had missed, the page nobody had reviewed in over 50 years. The analyst swallowed hard. This report was never finalized because the mission was canceled. Brooks frowned. Canceled for what reason? She shook her head. There is no explanation. Noah leaned forward. Near the bottom of the page was a single handwritten observation. Brief. Easy to overlook. Yet the moment Walter saw it, he closed his eyes. The note read, possible signs of long-term occupation observed near abandoned tower. Further investigation recommended. Nobody spoke. Brooks stared at the words. Noah felt a chill spread through the room. Long-term occupation. Not a temporary stop. Not a random shelter. Long-term. Walter slowly opened his eyes again. I told them, he whispered. Brooks looked at him. What? Walter's voice remained calm. I told them Ryan would head there. The old veteran looked toward the photograph still displayed beside the report. Ryan Mercer smiled from another era, frozen forever as a young man, while everyone who searched for him had grown old. Walter studied the face of the friend he had carried in memory for more than half a century. He always had a plan, he said quietly, even when nobody else could see it. The analyst continued scrolling. Additional attachments appeared. One contained a rough sketch of the ridge. Another showed the fire tower. Then a final image loaded. Grainy, faded, difficult to see. Yet the room instantly fell silent. Near the base of the tower stood a small structure. Simple, hand-built. Exactly where Walter had said it would be. Brooks lowered his head. Hours earlier, he had dismissed the old veteran as confused. Now every new document seemed to confirm what Walter had known all along. Noah looked toward him. Sir, he said softly, why did you never stop searching? Walter stared at the image for several seconds before answering. Because Ryan would not have stopped searching for me. Nobody had a response to that. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across the conference room floor. The analysts returned to their work with renewed urgency. New search requests were already being prepared. Old records were being reopened. The case was no longer cold. It was alive again. Brooks stepped beside Walter. "I owe you an apology." Walter shook his head gently. No, Brooks looked surprised. Walter's gaze remained on the photograph. "You owe Ryan your attention." The room fell silent one final time. Not because of rank. Not because of authority. Because everyone understood the truth. For 52 years they had searched for a missing soldier. Yet it took one forgotten veteran, one photograph, and one memory that refused to fade to finally point them in the right direction. Some people disappear from the records. The right people never let them disappear from memory.